Okay, hello everybody, ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow travelers. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all and welcome our speakers to today's panel. And I just wanted to give a short introduction. This is not the first museum panel we organize here at Art Basel, and I wanted to give you quickly a little bit the history of the panels we've done so far to give a context for today's conversation. But before that, I would like to thank Marc Spiegler, Annette Schönholzer, Aurelia Kreinbühl, and Sylvia Shivarot for the wonderful dialogue which led to this panel. And it really started all in 2002 in Miami with our Basel Miami, when we have a first panel actually with François Roche and Fernando Romero. And that was basically about the future of the museum. And we had then in Miami by telephone as a special guest in 2002, Yona Friedman. And today we have Yona Friedman here in person. This panel focused a lot on this idea of the museum being today also a form of urbanism, which is something I'm sure we're going to address later in the conversation. The string was then picked up on in Basel with the first panel here in 2002 with Jacques Herzog, John Armleder, Beatrix Ruf, Philipp Ursprung, and many others. That was a collaboration with Christina Bechtler. And ever since, we've tried to do a whole series of panels, really, showing the diversity and difference of different types of museum in the world. Edouard Glissant has always been the kind of model we've been thinking about. Edouard Glissant's idea of mondialité, where he says that at the moment when we have globalization and ever-increasing homogenizing forces of globalization, it's so important that museums are different in different parts of the world. And Glissant has come up with this very interesting museum as a poet, which he developed for Martinique. And that museum, which is an archipelago museum, shows that the museum of the 21st century follows less a continental logic of one sort of dominating continental block, but it's really a museum of many different archipelagos. We explored this further in actually discussions also about the public and the private museum. There was a panel in Basel about the future of the museum in China. There was the future of the museum in America, in the United States. There was the future of the museum in the Middle East. We had a very special focus on Latin America. The future of the museum in Latin America led then to the future of the museum actually in India. And more recently, we've also actually focused on a museum in Africa. So the whole thing, you can find it online with all this transcript. It is a little bit almost like an evolutive panel, because the belief is that there is too many events now, and it seems to be not satisfying to do these one-off things. So it's much more interesting over many, many years to work on a topic. And we are incredibly excited today with our wonderful speakers to add an important new chapter to this discussion. So our four speakers today are Emanuel Christ, Yona Friedman, Christian Kerez, and Farshid Mousavi. All of them have exciting new museums, and that was really the criteria we wanted today, to focus on new museum projects in the world, which we feel particularly relevant and urgent for the 21st century. The structure is that each of the architects will give a short introduction to their most recent museum projects, and we will then have a discussion, which we will also open to the floor in the second part of the panel. I now will immediately hand over the microphone to Emanuel Christ. Emanuel Christ of Christ and Gantenbein has actually been working on several museum projects. You all are certainly familiar with the big discussion of the Landesmuseum extension in Zurich, because very interestingly, it actually led to a popular vote, which won last weekend, and the museum can now go ahead. Christ and Gantenbein also won the competition for the extension of the Basel Museum, so we're going to hear about these projects now. And there is an unrealized project which is particularly interesting also, which they had developed for the Mund Museum in Oslo. A very warm welcome to Emanuel Christ.
Thank you very much, Hans Ulrich. I might need a computer or... Anyway, I'm glad that I have the opportunity to introduce a little bit of our work, and through that to introduce also our ideas and considerations about museums, art and architecture more generally speaking, and its relationship to the society and the city. I've been asked to touch on 3 projects, as you said, within 7 minutes. I try to make it shorter. It is not so obvious. I speed up, as you are doing, talking about this Edvard Munch Museum in Oslo. this is obviously at first an urbanistic intervention. Talking about museums, I think in general, we look at it from two different points of view. I mean, the first point of view is the urban one, the relationship between museum and the city and its society, and on the other hand, obviously, it is more a typological point of view, the organization of spaces and their use and potential use. This is a proposal for a complete redevelopment of Oslo Harbor area. You see the project consists of two things. On the left, a huge dock artificially built with a park on it, and on the right, the museum for the whole Munch collection. This is the new waterfront at the same time. I go on. A view in the opposite direction shows it is mainly about urban space. On the left, the new museum with the public arcade that leads to different entrances and auditoriums. In the middle, a huge square, and on the right, then this park that reaches out into the fjord of Oslo, and obviously the museum and this new public space are put in a very direct relationship. A scheme in section shows that the public functions, entrances, library, etc., auditorium is on the ground floor level, and then on the upper level is all the artwork, a very simple structure. It is almost a fragile structure that is also making reference to the industrial past of this site, maybe also to the temporary qualities of sheds and atelier buildings as the ones Munch was working in. And in plan, talking about the organization, the structure of such a museum, I mean, it goes very fast. Here it is about proposing a scheme that is very generous in terms of space, but also use. And you see on the very left on the plan is the storage area, and then on the same floor you would find in 4 different layers linear space structures for the galleries that are then also flexible in their compartments. A very straightforward plan, which I find very interesting and open, as I said, at the same time. I run and I go to the second project, that is the Kunstmuseum extension here in Basel. And from this urbanistic considerations, you could say it's nearly the opposite approach. The museum is literally emerging from the city. So it's much more about creating a statement out of the context of the place, but also, of course, out of the context of the institution and its collection. Here we see, at first, this new museum is a house. I'm almost tempted to say an ordinary building that is part of the fabric of the city and is a member of the urban society. Of course, at the same time, it must be more. It is the new face of Kunstmuseum Basel, so to speak. And with this very strong gesture in this body of the building, you see the attempt of creating a kind of a modest monumentality. And this new building is probably something between a classicist palais and a contemporary art container. And this art container, or this building, is of course then also put into a very direct relationship with the existing museum. So it is, in this case, also talking about the museum of the future. Many museums in the future will be extensions to existing museums, and that is a very specific discourse, obviously. And these two buildings are creating an urban space at first, but then they are also related to each other in a more precise way. And especially the position that is chosen for this entrance gesture of the new building is in a direct relationship with the well-known arcades of the old museum. And this is then also to be continued in the inside. There is obviously a visual connection between the two buildings, but also a conceptual one. The spaces are quite simple and calm. It is a generous layout of the plans. You would compare it probably on this drawing to the dimensions and proportions of the existing museum, which you might all know very well. It is a complementary scheme that is not the antithesis to the existing one. It is about continuity to some extent in this scheme, but also about offering dimensions, generosity that is missing in the existing. A very simple plan, less representative somehow. The existing museum is a palazzo. The new one is probably a bourgeois building. It's like a house. It's just scaled up. You know, it is a house, a building for art. And finally, on the section scheme, you can see that the two buildings are not only typologically related to each other. There is a physical connection, great foyer, public zone that is in a big hall connecting the two buildings in the underground level, but also on the ground floor then you would have entrances on both sides as you could see. Galleries are on this very low level in the basement related to a courtyard, a different space for art and public event on the ground floor in the new building, and then more classic galleries in the first and second floor with different light conditions. So a very coherent and in a way modest but self-confident gesture in this specific place. The last, third one, is the mentioned National Museum in Zurich, a project that is also was a competition project.
That was the Volksabstimmung, no?
Yeah, and then it was a referendum on it. So a highly exposed scheme for Swiss terms, very political, since it is about the national identity that is at stake in a house that is not an art museum. It is more about history and applied arts. And there is an existing, quite freaky building that is from it's like a fantasy architecture from the historicist period. And we are adding a new wing to that. So it is like a small city that is built there. You could say it's somehow probably the combination of the two previous schemes. It's on the one hand continuity and extension, telling the story on, and on the other hand, it is a completely new statement, and it is kind of reconfiguring the whole urban situation as well. So it is about the urban space, and of course then the exhibition spaces that are much more irregular, so to speak. It is not about the delicate balance between the artwork, we might talk about that, and the space around. It's more like an experimental tunnel for all kinds of exhibitions that are mainly working with scenography. So there is no daylight, it is a different condition, which I find very interesting and, as I said, quite experimental. And that's to close the plan that shows very clearly that this conglomerate of different building units is like added on and continued with this bent wing on the park side. And it is like one spatial continuum that closes a new closed circuit between the old and the new, and creates then also a very interesting vis-a-vis constellation. That's current museum work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emanuel.
Yeah.
Now I have the great pleasure to hand over to our next speaker, to Yona Friedman. A new book has just come out. It's extraordinary. It's almost a cube on more than 1,000 pages on Yona Friedman's work. So Yona's many, many decades of pioneering work in the museum led also very early on to reflections on the non-Western museum. To mention here, for example, the Museum of Simple Technology in Madras in India. Yona has done visionary projects, participated in the Centre Pompidou competition, and always also reflected on the portable museum, the mobile museum. So, for example, we have been working together a couple of years ago on a museum called the Nano Museum. A very warm welcome to Yona Friedman.
I am sorry, I will I don't hear quite well and didn't exactly hear what you are telling. Okay, so I will start in my own way. You know, the problem I see with the museums, that when we speak about a museum, we think about a building. Is a building really necessary for a museum? I don't think so. I think it's a 19th century idea. And you know, when I was trying the first time to do a project of a museum, it was for the Pompidou Center, I couldn't draw a facade because I was telling the facade will be completely different for each exhibition. And the building would be reshaped by the curator of the exhibition. You don't need the same space for all kinds of exhibition. And then I was putting later another question. Do you need really a building? A museum? This is the objects you expose. And I was doing in Italy about a few years ago something what I was calling a street museum. It was simply plexiglass boxes with objects in it. And the plexiglass boxes were heaped up. It was a sculpture itself, but the sculpture, then this museum was exposed elsewhere. It became a completely other shape. I feel somehow that museums and architecture in general is killed by a rigidity, a mental rigidity built into the things. I will not do projections because I am presenting here an object. So it's easier to see the reality. Imagine that in these objects, instead of the plastic sheets, there are plexiglass boxes with an exhibition, with the objects in it. But this installation, tomorrow it will be dismounted, and somewhere else dismounted completely otherwise. And now I will start to tell something, perhaps I am not right. I feel very unhappy with art museum. I don't think that art is exhibited in a museum. You know, it looks very scholarly. For me, it's a 19th century invention. Art all the time was part of something. It was not exposed in something in the churches, in the antiquity, but they had never the idea of a museum like simply it was on the street. I was now charged by a funny thing, the Museum of the Afghan Civilization. Okay, so I am not proposing a building. Again, I am proposing the plexiglass boxes and some passerelle with local technology installed in the hall where they made explode the big Buddha statues. It's nothing, again, I don't need even to give plans. It is local technicians do with their own techniques. And the museum comes from the plexiglass boxes, and what is in the plexiglass boxes. Now, one step further. The street museum I made in Italy, I didn't choose neither defined objects, but we were asking from the local population, please bring anything you want to expose. And on one thing, it's not insured, we don't guarantee that it will not be vandalized or stolen. Simply put there what you think you want to show. People were queuing up with plastic bags, bringing the object, and we were putting in it. And when the operation was made elsewhere, we did the same thing with other people. They were bringing what they thought. This is a museum of civilization. And you know, I feel always that I am walking in the biggest museum of the world, which are simply the shop windows in any big cities. It is the civilization. And if you are thinking what happens in museums, it is the scrap of old ages, something that people were thrown away, and then archaeologists found out. I don't know, the bones of the menu of the prehistoric man, and this is exposed in the museum. It's ridiculous. It's very interesting for scientific research, but a museum has to be living, has not be a building, but it has to be a continuous changing exhibition of a civilization. I don't know if I am walking and looking at shop windows in Shanghai or in Sana or in Paris, it is not the same because the civilizations are, even in the shop window, even the objects which might be the same mass-produced object, they are otherwise exposed because of the shop owner, because of the public. You know, I feel that our idea, what we inherited of the 19th century, it somehow false, it's scholarly, it's, there is the reality, the real life, which is its own museum. And if I agree that architects can give a frame for it, and this frame can be anything. I was doing, for example, a museum with graffiti using simple trees in a forest. You have the trees. We were stretching a transparent plastic foil, and you could graffiti on it. You don't need to build the wood is there. And the same thing in the street. Can you imagine that simply the lamp posts in a city? It's an incredible museum. Why not put objects on the lampposts? In the Middle Ages, they were doing it, not on the lamppost, if you want. So somehow, I think that there is too much from the architectural frame in the museum idea, and too little from the civilization, which is the topic. And this is not architects' fault. My colleagues here are wonderful architects. I am not speaking against them. It is somehow our society has the wrong approach. So I think that okay, I am an architect, I cannot do anything against it. I prefer to do things like I am doing, showing with this object. This is not for a museum. But if you want, give me plexiglass boxes. I can tomorrow transform it in a museum. You know, this is why I am not showing pictures, because I can refer to a reality.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Yona. Thank you very much. And as Yona says, he doesn't show pictures because you are all invited, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, to see his work here at the fair. Just when you come out of the lecture hall on the left-hand side, you can't miss it, is Jonas' Ville Spatiale, one of his great epiphanies. And then there is also a second piece, which is actually almost like a space within the space, which is a structure Yona built, where inside there is a piece by Huang Yongping. Many thanks to Yona Friedman. I now have the great pleasure to give the microphone to Christian Kerez. Christian Kerez has developed several extremely interesting museums. The first museum, I think, is Vaduz, was very early in his practice. Actually, a museum between the white cube and the black box, somehow oscillating. He then went on to win the competition for the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, which is now under construction and will open in 2014, and which is the project he will present to us here today. A very warm welcome to Christian Kerez.
Thank you. Is there
It's not on the screen.
okay, good. This is Warsaw. And you can recognize that if you look at the oldest tower in town. And it's happened to be also the most hated building in town. It's a gift from Stalin. And when I was first in Warsaw, I was much more impressed by the open wasteland just in front of this Palace of Culture and Science than by this building itself. So the initial idea was only to cover it with a roof with many different structures of beams and columns for different purposes, and on top of it another roof where the beams become walls, and the extension of this surface also becomes the facade. So that you, in the end, will experience a building which will look very closed from far away, but which is totally open if you stand right in front of it. All the spaces which have to be closed still allow a huge flow of visitors around it. And we made some pictures for a press conference that we just had 2 days ago, and it gives you an impression of the scale of the building, which relates also to the scale of the city. And the whole ground floor is actually set back, so that the roof, which is not only covering the inside but also the outside of this public square. And the entrance becomes just as an extension of this public square. The most important space is called the huge hall, which is a space for exhibitions free of admission, approximately 4,000 square meters big, with changing exhibitions. And actually what we were most interested in is the variation of space. So that you have many different possibilities for exhibitions, and we made a 1:33 model and made this very simple movie which shows how you can move around in this museum. This is the ground floor, where you see over the lockers into the changing exhibition room, which is totally open to a main street of Warsaw. so that the exhibition could also work like a shop window display. And another area is more for events. There will also be a theater inside this museum, and most of the ground floor is actually for event spaces. And this model was done because it's not a building which just have one perspective in particular, but you can rather reveal it by moving freely around under this huge roof. And in between the last pictures that you saw and these pictures, there's more than 1 year. And the project stayed very much the same, even if the program developed quite a lot, and there were even big changes within this program. So the idea just to cover the square and not to define different spaces worked very well also with the continuity of the idea. We now enter a very big exhibition space, which is maybe more for sculptures. This should represent sculptures by Monika Sosnowska. And then you could, from there, go to rather dark spaces, which are more for projections, or spaces which have purely north light. And most important is the experience from very different spaces. Some are narrow, some are bright, some are high, some are low, some are very bright, some are rather dark. And what is maybe also important to mention, the content is very specific. It will be the first museum for art from Eastern Europe, and I think it's also important for a museum, its purpose, to discuss its purpose, its meaning, its content, and not only let's say, its form and its shape. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many topics we can then explore in the conversation. Many, many thanks to Christian Kerez. I've got now the great pleasure to introduce Farshid Mousavi, a Foreign Office architect in London. Farshid has been actually involved in many reflections on the museum and publications, and has now designed actually her first museum, which is the MoCA in Cleveland. Now, this is a very special moment because we're actually now going to see a world premiere, because Farshid will for the first time today show images that actually talk in public about this new museum in Cleveland. A very, very warm welcome to Farshid Mousavi.
Thank you very much. Well, I have to confess I am the most junior here in the world of museum design, so this is the first, and it's a very small one. I have too many slides, so I am going to zoom through and not necessarily talk to all of them. I thought it would be interesting to start with just a general discussion. These are covers of two books that I have published in conjunction with teaching that I've been doing at Harvard. They focus on a question, which is what is the role of architecture in society? Does it play a role? How is that role changing? So, in other words, what is the function of architecture in society? And I guess in the context of the discussion today, I would like to argue that architecture doesn't meet culture at the museum, and argue that, in fact, perhaps architects don't curate the art, but curate the building, and that the museum in itself is a kind of a cultural, the museum building is a cultural experience. So the question is how buildings and a museum building in this situation creates this, becomes a cultural production, a form of cultural production. I have a lot of slides here really as a preamble to a discussion of, revisiting the relationship between built forms, objects, and people, and to argue that the history of architecture has tended to see object and subject in opposition or in the form of a duality. And this has, in a way, sustained a whole series of distinctions, whether built forms follow the intellectual process or whether they follow purely considerations relating to the object itself, the physical object. And so historically, we've had either approaches that are focused on what forms do or what forms mean. So somehow the action, the buildings as they perform and buildings and what they mean have been quite distinct. And we've sustained a kind of a representational approach to architectural built forms where somehow external factors, whether they are symbols or indexes, narratives are brought in to connect physical objects to society. I think that we need to examine a little bit more precisely the way forms perform, perhaps see a kind of a relation to a more distant history of perhaps even the ancient art of rhetoric that saw language, in that case, the structure of the language being formed, being manipulated in order to associate these forms with people in specific ways, in order to influence people, in order to engage with people, in order to establish a common ground between people in order to create a public. Now, the problem we have today is that, of course, the kind of cultural memory that existed in ancient Greece, we don't benefit from. So the question is how architecture can engage with a public that lacks this common ground in a world where it is highly molecular, it is no longer a monolith, and yet the technical, the cultural, and the social, environmental factors are very much interconnected that really challenge our understanding of the environment in forms of duality of the object and subject. I am going to whiz through this to get on to this discussion, which is to say I think that we need to re-examine the relationship between people and objects and to approach this relationship through perhaps an understanding that actually there is a transversal process that happens between people and objects, and it converges, or the byproduct of this relationship is a kind of a subjectivity that emerges through how the specifics of a certain built form or the specificity of a certain object and the individual desire of us and the individuals as we approach or engage with these built forms. So as an example, this is a cineplex that FOA designed in Leicester, finished a few years ago. its envelope transmits reflectivity, glare, and deformation. There are a couple of points around the building where all passers stop by and salute the building, no matter what sex, no matter what age, no matter what height, where they are from. Something happens between the building and these people as they look at it. And I think that we can use Deleuze's distinction between affect and affection to examine this process. The fact that affect, as he describes it, is a series of intensities, if you like, that are projected, transmitted by objects, by built form, as a result of how they are, their specific assemblage, their specific nature, whereas affections are those that grow through individuals coming into contact with these affects, and they rely on our specific background, language, on our education. So there is a social mediation, there is a biographical mediation that happens through us, and it results in feelings, in meanings, in emotions, in thoughts, and therefore the kind of culture that emerges as we interact with forms. So we'll go faster with these. These are some images of our Yokohama project. I would say the different regions of the building, because it is large, transmit different kinds of sensations. These then produce very different kinds of affections, different kinds of meanings. It would be impossible to know what feeling, what mood, what emotion each one of these people are encountering or producing, if you like, as they have come into contact with the different regions of the terminal. So I think that the power of built forms is really to produce that doesn't exist yet. So it is not really their physical, let's say the physicality alone, but what the physicality emits, what it produces, what it induces, if you like, in people. So these are some other museums. For example, I think it's interesting that the IMP building, the Smithsonian East Wing, has these sharp corners, and they are so blade-like that it gets people to go close and test it and rub it. And in fact, the corners have become sanded down along those heights where people touch it. Or for example, the Guggenheim Museum was obviously designed at a time when we had different building codes. Maybe it's not an intended intention of even the architect. And the handrails are unusually low. And you see in all these photographs that people lean into it. It's a very unusual museum. If you go to Tate Modern in London, people don't stop. It's more of a supermarket. I love the Tate. But it performs entirely differently. Whereas at the Guggenheim, people rest. People rest and look at the art. And this is the product of the architecture. And I think that that's important to recognize. Or maybe even there are other kinds of sensations that are more acoustic. For example, the Whispering Gallery, that because of the precise arched form of the space, it produces a kind of a sensation of intimacy. People gather in the corners to listen to the sound. Or a building here in New York, that the piano tower, that is made out of slats, the external facade, and it makes people want to climb. It actually induces the sport of building. So we go on to museums, and I'll be very brief. I think, you know, museums have grown. Maybe maybe I'm saying in a different way what Yona has already said. In a way, they've become something else, and I think we need to recognize that they are very large buildings. They are no longer just about the art. They involve lots of social functions. They involve a lot of circulation space that come in to connect the different events. And in a sense, you could say they're not, I believe they're not very different to a shopping mall. So the left are museums, the right are shopping malls. It shows that their scale are very similar, the ones that are recent. They share a blankness. They have hardly any contact with the urban context. So the urbanism that you produce is really, it has to be of a different kind because of the fact that there is no interface, hardly any interface between the interior and the exterior. There is literally a lobotomy between these two. Then obviously these interiors are used for very different functions. I think the circulation is an important dominant factor, and we already see, for example, the left is Cincinnati by Zaha Hadid, and the right is the Selfridges department store, where their circulation becomes a dominant part of your experience of the museum. They are highly air-conditioned, they are highly artificial, they are highly illuminated. The lighting is a very important feature. It's rare to find a dark art gallery. There is a relentless search for the ideal light, and this is not so dissimilar to what you find in shopping malls and shops. So we go on. I thought it would be just to show you images of a department store we designed in Leicester, which is one of these blank buildings where we focus on this very thin space, if you like, that the architect has available, and try to explore it as a screen, try to embed a number of contextual material that relate to the project. For example, the fact that John Lewis is a store that specializes in fabrics and textiles, and explore this envelope of the building and how it would perform or how it would emit sensations that are similar to a fabric or a textile. I will go on because we don't have time here. Just to show you some images of how the envelope is then designed with a pattern on it that is duplicated on 2 levels, that at an oblique it produces a kind of a moiré and becomes twice as dense and less revealing from the street, whereas from the shop floor it is very transparent and you can see out. So in a way the completely opaque frontage is turned into something semi-transparent. Our museum in Cleveland is another one of these. It's small, it's smaller than the Leicester department store, but it is a blank building. And here there is a blank skin, there is the circulation, there is perhaps this lobotomy between the interior and exterior that is even exaggerated. The building is intentionally made to be a hexagon, a building that has no orientation, a building that has 3 entrances, not 1, a building that acts almost as a pivot on a triangular corner site and resists the idea that there is one way to come into this building. And as a result, in fact, the ground floor can be organized in many different ways, depending on how many of the entrances are used at any one time. The gallery is a rectangular floor that can also be subdivided in a number of ways. And the volume literally emerges out of linking these 2 floors that have these extreme flexibilities, and it is intentionally dissociated from the load-bearing frame structure that hosts the art and the other exhibitions. And this distinction then grows to an envelope that actually has a diagonal ribbing and orientation, which is very different to the orthogonal structure, and starts embedding with the interior as well as the surrounding site with very different sensations of rotation, of non-orthogonality, of reflectivity, because the volume that results has actually faces, every other one of the faces either face the sky or face the ground, and therefore they project onto the skin the sky and the ground at once. That produces suddenly a very different reflection of reality, one where you don't normally see the sky and the ground at once on a plane. I think I will stop here. I was going to tell you about the stair, which is intentionally designed to produce many, many different ways of going through the stair. The fire stair and the public stair are stacked on top of each other to produce this monumental sculpture inside that allows you to take 20 different ways of going up and down 4 floors. And let's stop here. We can. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Many thanks to Farshid. We've got now lots of questions actually to discuss. One of the things I think which is very interesting, which kept popping up in all the presentations, is really the question of content and form. And at a certain moment, Rem Koolhaas said, "Form without content is meaningless shape," and that's definitely, I think, true for museums. Maybe more true for museums than for any other building. Now, obviously, the Museum of Contemporary Art, or the Museum of Living Art, has basically one big paradox, which is that at the moment when it is designed, or at the moment when it is developed, we do not know what art of the future will be, what will be the art in 10 or 20 years. I mean, we don't even know what the art will be over the years once it's built, because it takes several years to build the museum. And that's something Yona has addressed a lot, Cedric Price has addressed, this whole idea of uncertainty, of the unpredictability, how to cope with that. So I just wanted to see if you could comment on that, how very concretely, when you design museums, take this into account.
Well, I mean, just one thing that comes to my mind is that since you don't know how art will be and how art will intervene, there is probably one thing that I find quite obvious, is that you do not try just to anticipate a spatial and functional constellation that you cannot really predict. So therefore, you could also say the museum that I'm designing and building today is like more part of the urban condition of a specific site, and then art would come or not. That means when I'm building a museum in Basel in this very specific, quite, let's say, rigid way, that might be an invitation for art to create something out of it, or it won't be possible. But I mean, it's not possible to imagine something that is like already designed for a different purpose. Therefore, I like the idea that the museum is very much anchored in the urban society and context around. That is a reality today, because it's not only that we cannot know how art, future forms of art would challenge our museums, they also challenge our societies and way to perceive it. So it goes probably beyond just the smart plan.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? The idea of the unpredictable, l'idée de l'imprévisible, et comment peut-on construire un musée si on ne peut pas prévoir le futur de l'art?
Yeah, I don't know. Can I talk about another thing?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Permit and myself a joke a few weeks ago. You know about surrealism. Okay, so I was starting something I am calling subrealism. It's the, okay, I will perhaps explain. Surrealism generally adds something to things. Subrealism is looking at things less. So I would define that way. It would be not the thing, not a work of art, but the processes that leads to it, le devenir, and not the object. And I am telling you because, okay, I realize it, and that, for example, subrealism couldn't be shown in museums. It couldn't be, because it would be over-defined before it starts, And I think this would be perhaps, it is, I am not, no ambition to start a new school of art, but I think it would be interesting that to show not the objects, but always how it grows, how it becomes, whatever it is. I think that artists would be interested in it, and I am sure that the public too. And I am sure even architects are not against. So, you know, we have absolutely, it is our mentality, because of mathematics, because of our language, we look always at the product and we forget the process. And the process is important. The weakness of mathematics comes that it looks at results. But mathematics doesn't follow how the result is, how you get it. All our life is processes. You know, what we have somehow to present, and movie, cinema, is not that. It's faked. In the moment you are photographing, you fake it. You cannot do anything against it. So somehow, perhaps I could find it wonderful that an object is made by an artist, that somebody of the public comes in and adds, okay, I would like to add here a patch. Why not? You know, it's not collective work, what I'm speaking. It's the process, it's something becoming something. And I think this is not directly linked to the Theme Museum, but perhaps it's more fundamental.
No, it's got a lot to do. It's got a lot to do with it, and that reminds me also of a conversation we had when Olafur Eliasson had invited you, to the exhibition we curated of his at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris many years ago. When he invited you to a space within the exhibition, and we discussed a lot this idea of almost the exhibition being biological, kind of being alive, growing, etc. But it leads me to a question I wanted to ask all the other participants in our panel, and that's really the dialogues with artists. I mean, we had the dialogue with you and Olafur Eliasson, but I know, for example, that Emanuel, for your museum, there was a very close dialogue with Peter Fischli and Fischli Weiss, and I'm sure that in the case of Farshid and Christian museums, there must also be dialogues with artists. Can you tell us about how that kind of enters the process?
I mean, in the case of our dialogue and collaboration with Peter Fischli, this was somehow a very simple thing. We found it important to challenge our design process by a person who is at first rather representing a user of a museum, an artist who is curating his own shows and also reflecting beyond that. It turned out that Peter Fischli was almost more an architect than we were. So since he has a capacity in kind of understand and simulate a reality, he were like becoming an architect and urbanist in our discourse. And he is not the author of the project. He was like a sparring partner to question our project hypothesis. But it was not an artistic procedure. It was a very kind of a professional talk with him that was very, very important. And I think he was at some point obviously more free to ask some questions we didn't think of, but in a very realistic way that was poetic at the same time.
And Christian, how does this work in Warsaw? How is the dialogue there? I mean, you mentioned Monika Sosnowska. Are there dialogues with artists who somehow enter your process of building this museum?
Well, there were several discussions with artists, but let's say I think the work of an artist is very different to the work of an architect. And I think also it is important that an artist has like the possibility to escape the museum, or that he has something which we even might get into opposition to it. So coming back to the question of the freedom of the museum, how do you build for something which you don't know in advance? This sounds as a beautiful idea, to make something which can freely develop. But in, let's say, common, ordinary daily life, this freedom has another significance. It has a word, and this is flexibility. And flexibility always goes with monotony. For example, this space is totally flexible. You can not only look at artworks, but you can also look at cars or at washing machines or whatever. And the only freedom that remains in a flexible building is the amount of space which you can get. Is it smaller or bigger? That's all. And in the Art Museum in Warsaw, it was very important to underline the idea of flexibility in another way by creating a roof which is shaped, which has many different heights and intake of sunlight, so that even if you divide it in different forms, you will not get this monotony. So I think this is a very crucial question, because architecture becomes very often like the slave of the freedom of the user. And flexibility is really extremely demanding and limiting issue in architecture. Even if I adore the idea of free architecture or of developing architecture, as Yona mentioned it before.
Farshid, what is your view on this? Can you tell us?
On the issue of flexibility?
Yeah, flexibility, but also the connection to artists.
Artists, on the MoCA Museum, we haven't worked with an artist. I've been in touch with, obviously, artists in the city, but I have worked with Carsten Haller on quite a few occasions. He invited me to work with him on a kind of a theoretical tower made out of slides when he was doing his show at the Tate, and since then we have done a few competitions together. It's a rare collaboration because I think Carsten is himself like an architect. You know, his slides are buildings. So we have a lot of common ground, and I thought the very first collaboration, I thought it was very interesting because he acted as a client. So he wrote the brief, and I thought that was quite interesting to see an artist in that that he wrote the brief for the tower, or even designed the tower in words, and we spatialized it, knowing that it was, of course, was going to use slide, which was part of his work, and it was very interesting to see how an architect, an artist can also design spatialized through words. It was very interesting. On flexibility, I somehow think that in a way I don't find flexibility a limitation. What you were saying, and I think all flexibility means is buildings is that it's long span. You need to work with long span rather than short span, because short span means that you limit the space more, and it also means that probably your walls, if there are any, are not fixed. But there are so many ways of designing a flexible space, and you just have to look at the work of Mies and the different galleries that he's done, and they are all flexible, but they're all entirely different. And the sensation that they give you are super different. So I don't think that flexibility is a constraint, is a trajectory, if you like, in a certain building. It's a direction, and it's no less imposing than if you had a building to design that had to be very cellular. A cellular building is very limited if you want to talk about limitations. And I think buildings grow because of the trajectories that they need to follow, because of the way they are to become. You know, I don't really find it a limitation.
Yeah.
No, I was just thinking, I mean, also when you're mentioning Mies van der Rohe, I mean, this is probably the most specific museum. You could, the National Gallery in Berlin, for instance, which I find very interesting, and it's true, it's very open as a space, but it is very, very, I mean, the top floor and also the ground floor, it's very, very specific, and therefore also very challenging to art and curators, and I think this is probably the most important thing. Of course, the building has to have a kind of intelligent logistics and structures, but then it is, I don't see necessarily a difference between a cellular or open plan in terms of its long lifespan, because it is about a specific character, and then art would enter in a dialogue. And of course, it must work to some extent, but it would be totally boring if a museum building then exactly turns into something like that, which is actually temporarily one of the most beautiful museums, one has to say. I mean, the Art Unlimited is a fantastic museum. But I don't see this very close relationship between the structure and its future use.
Yona, you want to say something?
I would tell a small story. In the year 2000, an architecture review asked for me for a project, the Museum of the 21st Century. Now, obviously, nobody knows what will be the 21st century. So I proposed as an idea a very simple thing, a sort of a ville spatiale, that means a skeleton, and simply people living in it. And they live their own way, 100 years. And every year, there is a commission which goes over and tells this object and that object we fix. And then you continue, everything changes. And, you know, it is absolutely imprevisible what will be the result. I tried to explain. Imagine a museum at 1800, okay, the 19th century. It starts with Napoleon and it finishes with the radio, with the quantum theory. You know, it's absolutely imprevisible what happens in a century. This is when I was talking about a minimum frame is necessary. But the museum is the real thing, what people do in it and what they leave behind. So I think somehow it is the concept of museum which has to be thought over. There is something false. It is the architectural solutions, they are good. All the solutions are good, but the concept is wrong.
I have Emanuel, yeah?
No, I was just to probably ask a question or to raise a thought. I mean, isn't it the case that more and more art is produced for the museum, and therefore, and eventually for specific museums? So this question of the a priori is an interesting one. Is there first the art and then the museum follows, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, it's a discussion we had the other day when, you know, we went to see Gabriel Orozco's show, which is so beautifully installed here in the museum in Basel, and we spoke about it in several other conversations. And to some extent, the question obviously is, and that's something Cedric Price also often discussed, which is this idea that maybe when there is a new form of space needed, it doesn't necessarily mean that the old space is not needed anymore. So to some extent, there could almost be a very big variety of typologies, no? Which could be combined in a museum. We don't want to lose the type of space of the 19th century which is proposed, even if Yona is right, obviously, that now we go beyond that, and that we need a 21st century museum which maybe has also no longer to do with objects. And if we think about a practice like Tino Segal and what that means, which is totally intersubjective, where you don't have any objects anymore. So when I spoke about this dilemma to Cedric Price, he said, it was in one of our last conversations, he said, a 21st century museum will utilize calculated uncertainty and conscious incompleteness to produce a catalyst for invigorating change, whilst always producing the harvest of the quiet eye. And that obviously meant that he wanted there to be zones of silence, he wanted there to be zones of noise. I mean, it's always very fascinating to be alone in a museum and then all of a sudden all the people arrive and you go from a very silent zone into a noisy zone, as we went this morning, by the way, because when we arrived here it was very silent. Cedric was also saying that we need basically spaces which are fast and spaces which are slow. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this and also to which extent the models from the past are maybe still useful. I mean, Panofsky said, if we want to invent the future, we always invent it out of fragments from the past. I mean, it's a long question, but many possibilities.
I think Panofsky actually has some interesting parallels. He makes interesting parallels between architecture and cinema, for example, and how, you know, buildings are a kind of a performance, like, and they unfold over time the way a movie unfolds over time. And I think discussions of flexibility, there are many ways to approach how buildings are flexible. And I think there is a resilience to buildings that we too easily forget. And that, apart from the fact that buildings, you know, have a long life, etc., I do think that the same way that we, as an audience here, would go to a movie, experience the same movie, but would come out having perceived that movie entirely differently. You know, I sit watching a kind of a sad movie, and you can be sure I will cry at the end, and I'm often next to somebody who would not cry. And I think buildings perform in a similar way, that there is a kind of a plurality embedded in them that I don't think needs to be physically enacted, and we need to see different scenarios. I do think that buildings have this this ability to, and objects generally, to engage with people, just because we are different. And it goes back to the discussion that I was mentioning earlier about their affect and their sensation. We engage with buildings in many different ways, and the kind of multiplicity that we beg of our buildings, and we generally expect them to physically change in a mechanical way, I think they do it in a non-mechanical way. And I think this is why good buildings last, and their uses may change, but they remain a vital part of a certain context. And you know, good buildings do remain.
I totally agree.
But basically, a museum is just a place which allows you an encounter with art, but also a factory, also a private apartment can allow exactly the same encounter. And I think most important for a museum building is that it allows a specific encounter with art. That if you encounter a building, a picture maybe by Mark Rothko in different museums, that it's also a different encounter. So in this way, I would say an ideal museum also is just impossible. And maybe the example which you gave by Mies van der Rohe is very good, because it's an awful museum if you think of it in terms of function. But it is a great museum if you think of very specific encounters with artworks which are totally different than in any other museum in the world.
And one thing which very often pops up when I speak to artists, I mean, Trisha Donnelly told me the other day that she thinks there is something really terrifying about the loss of the outside, which you have in museums, which you can have in museums. So being terrified by the loss of the outside. Basically, Dominique Gonzalez-Förster said, it's a park, it's a plan for escape. And how do you deal with this whole inside-outside logic within your museums? Is maybe one thing we haven't addressed yet. I mean, Yona spoke about the street. Sure.
I mean, sure, there are some functional, or might be some functional problems. In the Basel case, this project we somehow try to keep it a kind of ordinary building that is able to interact with the urban space around it. So, I mean, let's keep it simple. In the end, it's a question about windows, no? And we proposed windows that are exactly establishing or offering this interaction. But we all know also that there is then, of course, many problems in controlling light and so. But I think it is fundamental that you do not completely cut off your inner space experience from the outside, because then we weaken this specificity that was also mentioned by Christian, that you should remember that you saw this sculpture in Warsaw or in Basel or wherever, and how do you do? I mean, this is a very interesting question.
Anybody else want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think architects can be quite old-fashioned about this interior, exterior, and forgive me. I think that if truly the interest is a relationship between inside and outside, we have, you know, our mobile phone. I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but somehow architecture is completely powerless as a means to connect interior and exterior. You know, at a time when we are connected to the world at the tip of our finger, I think that relationship is, in a way, I think we need to focus on when transparency is actually desirable and when it is productive rather than counterproductive. Now, if you are having a non-collecting art gallery that needs to have different exhibitions, like this, let's say, it doesn't need a natural light, it's counterproductive. And I think your request for specificity, so that you're not in a neutral and bland space, can happen without you necessarily seeing the outside.
Sure.
You know, I think that the Mies gallery in Houston, frankly, can be anywhere. You can just take it and, you know, because but it's a highly specific building, and it's very different to his National Gallery in Berlin. You come in and the floor is half raised, and you simultaneously see two exhibits. You feel that the floor is somehow fragile and is floating. It's very different to the Berlin one, where the ceiling is heavy and covered over you, and where you have natural light. I think you can provide specificity without necessarily seeing outside.
Oh, sure. Sure.
Well, I think the difference of interior and exterior, which also might go with the question that you have a building which is totally closed to the outside, also maybe has the danger that the building becomes like an artwork itself, or as an object which is exposed. This also is, especially today, a big danger, because you have such a big list of requirements what a shell, a facade should obtain. And in the case of Warsaw, it was a very big issue that the building should relate to a maximum extent the interior to the exterior, so that also the interior space is not something independent, but it's more like a extension of the surrounding.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
But don't you think that can happen, that the building can have a very specific dialogue with its context through its exterior, and it can have a very specific dialogue with whether it's art, people in the interior? Do you not think it can? I mean, the lining of your jacket, I don't know how it is lined, but you know, the outside might be stripy, and you know, a tailor has been very careful to continue the stripe here, etc., to play you know, a continuity between your sleeve, but maybe the inside of your lining needs to be soft because it makes you feel good. And you know, why does it have to be that they have to do the same job? Why?
Well, let's put it that way. For me, architecture is also something very physical, very solid, very massive. It consists always of huge amount of weight. I'm very much interested in this specific aspect, and so my thinking of how to relate the interior and exterior has to do, let's say, also with this massiveness.
Yeah.
And this is a specific approach.
Yeah, yeah.
But I agree, of course, with you that this is not the only one, but it's, let's say, the one that interests me personally the most.
And that actually leads me to a very last question, then maybe we can open it quickly to the floor for if you have urgent questions. But I've got a last question for Yona. We've discussed in these museum panels over the last 7-8 years a lot of specific models, and there have been particularly a lot of discussions about non-Western museums, all the hundreds of museums emerging in China, in India, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and these very, very new museums which basically are not necessarily replicating Western models of museums, but which create very specific new institutions. And Yona, you have very early developed museums in the non-Western world. You've done a museum in India, in Madras. Can you tell us a little bit about the specificity of these projects?
You know, it's perhaps, but I think that there are some conceptual differences. I don't think that architecture is important. I don't think really that art is important. Simply people are important. And I think that somehow architecture has to be made by people. So I was looking for techniques, how they can do it. Most of the things I am doing, I am not doing. I let people do it. It's a difference. You know, somehow, I think my role, I feel, is simply incitation. Give an idea, throw it on the sea, and okay, something will happen with it. I cannot determine what will happen with it. You know, this kind of structure I am telling only because it's here. It could be anything else. I don't know what is coming. We came here. If I wouldn't be here, there would be only the workers. It would have another shape, that it would be always done. In art, now this is about architecture, but in art, it is the public who makes the art, not the artist. The artist tries to throw an idea there, and people interpret it. It is people's interpretation. And people, I am not speaking about a collective, informal mass. They are individuals. Each individual will interpret it differently. And that's what I am driving at. You know, when I was speaking about art as a process, I think it's a process because individual people will enter. I made it in India, and I don't know, in the 2002 Biennale, I was making a montage. I had to go. The workers finished it very well in their own way. You know, somehow I find that art and architecture became too much expropriated by the profession who's doing, by the artist, by the architect. It's somehow the idea that the professional architect, artist, politician, economist is the master. No, it is not. It is not. By the way, it shows that always going wrong. But perhaps when it's going wrong is the right way. The thing is more complicated. So that's what I am believing. Somehow, it is you who are important, you and you and you, not simply you as a collective one. And I can only talk about, and you take whatever your interpretations. And this is why I am afraid of museum. This is why I am afraid of city planning, which is generally giving catastrophic results of architecture. Shanty towns are never badly planned.
That's very true.
You know, and simple are improvised by people. It's never badly done. Even, you know, when I am now very old, but when I was a child, working people were singing. Now they put on the tape recorder, or, you know, music cannot live if people don't sing. It cannot be only a canned product. But let us tell one step, even with canned product, you can do, I'm thinking about Kerez's concert for 24 radios. Even this is possible, but somehow all of you have to understand that the initiative is with you. And that's really the point I am driving.
There could not be a more wonderful conclusion, and that brings us to you and urgent questions for Emanuel, Yona, Christian, Farshid. Do we have any questions from the floor?
There is a question on the left.
There's a question on the left. If we might have a microphone, thank you.
A question for Yona Friedman. After the bombing of the statues of Tiananmen in Afghanistan, you had the utopia to rebuild a musée de rue. Can you tell us about that, please?
You know, they were asking projects from several people, and I was the only one who didn't propose a building, but telling there is a situation. The site in itself is an important thing, because it was the big Buddha statue which was destroyed. It's a whole. It is already a historic object. And then I think it is the objects what they want to expose is important. And as I thought it shouldn't be simply on the floor, so I was like a scaffolding out of wood with the local techniques, made by local technicians, and there simply the boxes around, people walk around. You know, I was telling that the shop windows are the real museum today. And okay, I was trying to imitate the bazaar. That means you have these wooden bridges and staircases, and all around. Yes, like the bazaar people expose their merchandise. The objects are exposed only with plexiglass boxes against weather. Against stealing, you cannot do anything, because they can take the plexiglass and go away. You know, in Paris we had a art robbery a few weeks ago. That's really how to expose. And I think that I saw it really that way, that what we would need today would be these neighborhood street museums. In every neighborhood, people come out. I don't know what they want to expose. This is Afghanistan. I don't know what they want to expose. But what they consider is important. And it is different from the shop window, because shop window is commercial. Somebody exposes what he wants to sell. But what would people expose if they don't want to sell? They have to be proud, you know?
Yeah.
Is that little chap in the banlieue, he's go, come and see my new tea table. No, expose it. You know, it's really, the difference is not a hardware difference.
No.
The solution is a different concept, a different way of thinking. And that's what I am trying to do everywhere if I am presenting something, showing that, okay, you can look in another way at something. And okay, how you do it technically, that's a second discussion.
Great. Do we can take maybe one last question, an urgent question from the floor. Yeah, we have a question here in the first row, please.
Well, a bit more than the question, I saw that, closer, yes. The word flexibility was the most important word in your debate at the end. But then you introduce another concept of the connection between the inside and the outside of the museum. In fact, if you visit in Basel, we have a perfect example. If you visit the Fondation Bayelair, you have a very beautiful room with a nice sofa, and you have the Monet flowers, and you have a beautiful window on your left side, and you have the reality outside. So this could be an example of a relation between the inside and the outside. It can be also a bit dangerous because it's a bit tautologic. Establish the relation between the reality and the fake. But then back to your concept, I think sometimes the museum today are more like prisons than like churches. We say, has been said that the museum are the church of the 28th century. Sometimes the form of the museum is a form, is a prison, very, very, very closing from the outside. So I think also the problem of flexibility. Flexibility must be a sort of neutrality. I don't see the flexibility as something mechanical, but something in our mind. Of course, we don't know today what art will be tomorrow, and how to prepare a building for some unknown artworks. I like the Parthenon because it's the same since 2,500 years, and I find that the Parthenon is a very flexible structure.
A wonderful conclusion of our debate. Does any of our speakers want to comment on this?
I didn't hear the question.
Because otherwise I think it wraps it up in a wonderful way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.